For more on the humanitarian situation, we're joined by Dr. Eyal Miroz, who's Senior Lecturer of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. So, Dr. Miroz, we've been focusing on Syrians at home. Let's zoom in on the diaspora. Upwards of 8 million who fled, absorbed mostly by Turkey and further afield. They're living in poverty. What's the ambition, you think, of these refugees now?
Well, I think the happiness with the fall of the Assad regime is well in place. The regime and Assad at the helm have destroyed Syria and caused, as you've mentioned, close to 600,000 casualties. However, the Syrian people, whether in Syria or outside of Syria, are far away from being out of the woods. I think the situation and what is coming next for Syria is highly precarious. And so those outside, obviously, the situation in Lebanon is so bad that we've already seen convoys on the way back into Syria. But in other places, I would advise people to stay put because a lot can happen. And the challenges that are facing Syria at the moment, so many different factions and so many enmities and hatreds that are still there that were put aside during the fight to oust the regime may now come about. The country is bankrupt, the system is corrupt, and so these refugees should stay and see, hopefully, if the international community together with the Syrian people can make something positive out of this ousting of the regime, and then gradually come back once they can.
And to restore all these troubles that you've been mentioning, there has to be power, and we know that a power vacuum has to be filled. You know, of the Syrians who fled, those who grew up in the country in better times, who had better access to education, could potential leaders be fielded from these returnees? And how could their overseas exposure, for example, shape the future of the country?
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of brain drain. People that have, the capacity and the ingenuity to leave Syria during the war have left and are certainly going to provide a very much needed support for the structuring of a new country in a new system in Syria. However, at the moment, the situation is still in the hands of the militants and the different military factions. And in this situation, I fear that what needs to be done is some kind of mutual support between the different powers, between regional powers and the Syrian people inside Syria to try to see how to prevent what had happened both in Iraq and in Libya after the ousting of their dictatorships that collapsed into mayhem. So the international community needs to be much more careful in how it helps the Syrian people to build a new system. And these people outside should contribute. But in terms of masses coming back, I would advise to wait.
Okay, well, in terms of help, what of the ongoing humanitarian efforts to help Syrians in and out of the country? We know there'll be competition for funding. All sorts of institutions need to be held up, like you said, and we're unclear even about the safety of these aid workers in the country. What do you expect when it comes to meeting the basic needs of Syrians?
Well, the two countries that were owed billions of dollars from the Syrian state, Iran and Russia, have now lost their foothold. Well, the Russians will see whether they struck some kind of a deal with the rebels to maintain their two assets that you mentioned earlier or not. But other than that, there's certainly a need for a lot of money for lifting the sanctions that were put in place. And obviously massive support that needs to be very carefully calibrated, both in terms of humanitarian aid, but also in other ways to try and try to the best possible way to ensure that the different factions, and including the main factions, see that it is in their interest to avoid what had happened in Libya and Syria by protecting the ethno and religious minorities and and not going after revenge against the existing system, which was very much responsible to the what had happened in Iraq, for example, after the second Iraq war.
Dr. Miraz, a quick thought from you about Europe now. How do you suppose that region is bracing itself for the possibility of a fresh refugee crisis? Because already the countries there are increasingly leaning to the right. Europe on guard?
Yes, I think that's a big question. As you mentioned, a lot of the anti-immigration, if you like, parties in a number of important European countries have gained power in recent times, and so the fear of, on one hand, of more refugees coming out of Syria, and also the desire for existing refugees in these countries to go back to Syria is very powerful. And so these European countries will have to kind of juggle being, on one hand, onlookers, as they may have done in situations that needed more help, such as in Sudan, and at the same time try to help build a new Syria. So these Syrian refugees will have a place to go back to.
Very good getting your thoughts. Thank you, Dr. Eyal Miraz, Senior Lecturer, Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney.